Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In one of our recent videos, we took a look at how one single starfighter changed the course of galactic history. The starship in question was the Incom Aggressive Reconnaissance 170, a bulky, three-man crew multi-purpose fighter that suffered massive casualties flying against droid fighters during the Battle of Coruscant in front of an audience made up of the galaxy's political and military elite. This fighter performed so poorly during this battle that the Republic Navy starfighter doctrine would shift from larger multi-purpose starfighters to a focus on smaller and more nimble single-seater craft. This would ultimately lead to the development of the TIE fighter line, mainly made up of short-range interceptors that would form the backbone of the Imperial fleet. The Empire's strategy with these TIE fighters was to use mass production to create numerical superiority. And in the first decade of the Empire's rule, there was a real lack of near-peer enemies for the Empire to fight, so they could just field subpar designs and rely more on sheer numbers and firepower to overwhelm whatever enemy they're fighting. But TIE fighters lack shields and hyperdrives, making them expendable assets rather than sustainable war machines. In any pitched battle against a serious enemy with the latest technology and military hardware, the TIE fighter found itself pretty lacking. And after several years of fighting the rebel insurgency, the lack of survivability for pilots when using the TIE platform began to affect the talent in the Empire's pilot pool. And so it's my belief that the ARC 170's failure during the Battle of Coruscant directly led to the widespread adoption of the TIE fighter. Now, what would have happened if the ARC 170 never was at the Battle of Coruscant? What if it never failed in such a grand fashion that it didn't shift the military culture in the Republic Navy and the Imperial Navy, instead had a more balanced strategy when it came to figuring out what their new starfighters would be like? Well, to understand how that scenario would happen, well, we have to understand the state of the starship manufacturing industry at the time. As mentioned in our last video, prior to the start of the Clone Wars, the starship manufacturing sector was pretty nascent because of the Republic's unprecedented era of peace that came before it, which lasted almost 1,000 years. This meant that there was a complete lack of military culture in the galaxy. It meant that most of the shipbuilding talent was focused on civilian and commercial designs. And so this environment actually created a lot of opportunities for new manufacturers and new shipbuilders to jump into the starship manufacturing industry for these military contracts. It was basically a level playing field for a lot of these pretty new companies. Which leads me to my theory that I'll expand upon in another video, that Palpatine started the Clone Wars not only to assume political control of the Republic, but also to expand, upgrade, and eventually consolidate the military-industrial complex. It's kind of a brilliant plan. Now, at the time, he had several different manufacturers competing for a variety of different starfighter contracts that the Republic Navy really needed to be filled out as quick as possible. And since the Republic was stewarding over a free market, they preferred that different companies took these contracts and not just one company dominated everything. This is how Koenigsegg Manufacturing and Incom Corporation, along with Slan and Corporal, were able to land contracts to build their own iconic starfighters. These three manufacturers were all pretty new to this industry and were either producing their first or second starfighter ever. But there were also big fish as well, like the corporation or planet known as Kuat. Kuat was basically a legacy shipbuilding world, one of the largest in the galaxy. They actually predate the 1,000 years of peace that the Republic enjoyed prior to the Clone Wars. They remember the time when the galaxy was in constant state of warfare, usually thanks to the epic struggles between the Sith and the Jedi. The founders of Kuat built a massive orbital shipyard above their planet, one that circumvented the entire globe. It was here that all of the largest capital ships in the galaxy were constructed. It was on Kuat that the Imperial-class Star Destroyer would also be pumped out. At peak efficiency, they could even finish one of these vessels a day. I mean, these were 1.6 kilometer long living cities. That is impressive. Kuat Drive Yards, through its subsidiaries like Rothana Heavy Engineering, also secretly built the Acclamator-class assault ship, the ATTE Walker, and the LAAT clone gunship. These were the vehicles that would launch with the secretive clone army on day one. Kuat also had a subdivision known as Kuat Systems Engineering, led by the supremely talented designer and engineer Willix Blissix, and they were ready to expand to a massive size to meet the needs of the Republic Navy. Kuat Systems Engineering provided the Jedi with the Delta 78th Sprite prior to the war, and would build several different models of fighters for the Navy, including the Eta Actis and later on the V-Wing, which would replace most Republic fighters at the end of the war. It's kind of like a peacetime one-size-fits-all cost-saving solution. Now, even though Palpatine wanted to consolidate the entire military-industrial complex beneath his control, he still wanted individual operators to control certain segments of that market. And he didn't want Kuat to not only build all the capital ships, but also the starfighters as well. So what does he do? He removes Kuat Systems Engineering, the starfighter branch of Kuat Drive Yards, and hands it over to another company known as Republic Senior, a relatively unknown entity at the time. They're basically a boutique ship designer that was focused on custom-built ships loaded with proprietary and cutting-edge technology. It was kind of a strange occurrence because you have a really small entity like Shelby, for instance, taking over Ford, or AMG taking over Mercedes, something like that. You just don't usually see this happen. It also helped that the founder of Republic Senior Systems, Wraith Senior, was a close friend to Palpatine. This is how autocrats like Palpatine rolled. They generally don't trust institutions and systems. They don't want checks and balances. They don't want their underlings challenging them. And so they usually hire individuals who are loyal directly to them so that they can control these individuals. So Senior Fleet Systems went from building like maybe a dozen ship at most a year to becoming one of the largest manufacturers in the galaxy. But here's the thing, there was another starship company that was extremely innovative and passionate about what they were doing, and they're probably in a better situation to handle a job like this. And of course, we are talking about Incom Corporation, the individuals who made the failed ARC-170 platform. They also designed the Z-95. They were technically still in the running to develop the next generation Imperial fighter that would be the TIE Fighter. Their entry was the prototype that would be gifted to the Rebellion. It was known as the T-65V X-wing. Actually, the first X-wings used by insurgents were stolen from Imperial assembly lines by Saw Gerrera's partisans. And so, as you can see, the Empire was still basically testing these starfighters out, running them through trials, seeing if the X-wing was viable for mass production. So in our scenario, without the ARC-170 disaster on Coruscant, the Imperial brass would be free to see that the T-65V X-wing is really the perfect solution to the Empire's security needs, especially in the sparsely populated Outer Rim, where much of their security headaches will emerge. This starfighter was fully equipped and able to operate independently from larger carrier ships thanks to its Class 1 hyperdrive, pressurized cockpits, and heavy construction. It also had shields and heavy munitions as well. And so, if we are to believe in magical bear families that live in single-family homes in the woods, then Mama Bear's porridge is the Z-95, Papa Bear's porridge is the ARC-170, and Little Bear's porridge is the X-wing. It's just perfect. Nimble and agile like the Headhunter, but far more robust and feature-packed like the ARC-170, without being too excessive when it comes to cost of running. I mean, even at 3 times the cost of the TIE Fighter, the X-wing is still, I think, a viable platform to be operating, especially because of all the cost-saving measures it gives you. For instance, you can operate these X-wings without a larger transport vessel like a Star Destroyer or even a smaller cruiser carrier or even a Gazanti class freighter. All that stuff, all that additional support costs money. Now you can just run these X-wings independently. And actually, if we replace the Imperial class Star Destroyer with the Gladiator class Star Destroyer, which is a lot cheaper, we mentioned this in our previous video, the X-wing fitting in the budget would be even more realistic. I mean, that is basically our ideal situation. You have X-wings and Gladiator Star Destroyers running most of the Outer Rim patrol routes. More expensive fighters and cheaper capital ships. And that's because the Empire's, ability to control who gets capital ships in the Star Wars galaxy was pretty good. I mean, you just couldn't buy a frigate if you were a pirate or some kind of insurgent. Most of these unsavory characters relied on smaller snub fighters and like freighters converted into warships, which again is no challenge for an X-wing. If the Empire fielded the X-wing, it would drastically change the Imperial naval doctrine and how it approached patrolling the galaxy. Currently, the Empire uses sector fleets to maintain control of regions of space. This fleet was usually built around a dozen or more Imperial-class Star Destroyers and its supporting vessels. These were further separated into smaller groups that would patrol various areas of the sector. But in total, we're talking about only maybe 20 to 100 ships that are hyperdrive equipped and capable of carrying their own TIE fighters into battle. The Empire also utilized small bases with garrisons and TIE fighters on more important worlds and planets, but these units were usually limited to only local actions because of a lack of hyperdrive. And so, as you can see, when you base your defense around the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, you're just concentrating a lot of resources in one area. You can't really spread things out like you would want to when you have an area like a sector, which is a massive amount of space. But let's take a look at how many TIE fighters the Empire usually places in a sector. Well, if there's 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers for 1,000 sectors, that means 25 Imperial-class Star Destroyers per sector, and each one can hold 72 TIE fighters. That means a minimum of 1,800 TIE fighters are in each sector, along with whatever else you have deployed on other ships, and from planet and orbital bases. And so we're talking about a few thousand to maybe tens of thousands of TIE fighters, depending on what sector you're in. Which means that the Empire could probably afford to field at least 1,000 or 2 X-wings as well. Again, if you replace the Imperial-class Star Destroyer with the Gladiator, that makes it completely feasible. And because these ships are hyperdrive equipped and have proton torpedoes, they can do like 95% of the job that an Imperial capital ship does, at least when it comes to handling and interdicting criminal vessels. And so now, instead of having a few dozen or 100 ships or individual entities that can patrol the galaxy, you have thousands of X-wings that can go anywhere in a sector. And, again, these sectors have, 50 inhabited worlds, maybe 10,000 dependencies that are inhabited, and then you have hundreds of millions of stars you still have to patrol because there might be people hiding, in those areas like rebels. On top of that, now your planets and orbital bases where you have X-wing attachments on aren't just used for local response, they can go to other systems. It creates a much larger network for quick reaction if there is trouble in the sector, and so now when rebels or pirates strike in the region, you can have dozens of units coming from multiple directions at staggered times to respond to an attack, instead of just having to wait for that big and cumbersome Star Destroyer to get crewed up, fueled up, and, make it on location. If you take a look at the Republic Navy, after the Galactic Civil War ends, this is their main strategy. And even though they don't provide a lot of assets for the Outer Rim, the X-Wings that are there are very effective. Take a look at pirates and bandits in the Star Wars galaxy. They are absolutely terrified of X-Wings in the New Republic. And these X-Wings are everywhere. As long as, the Central Political Committee allows them to attack these criminal elements, they will destroy them with great ease. What makes the X-Wing so great, again, is their flexibility, their ability to do everything from reconnaissance, patrol, interception, to assaulting ground targets and even capital ships. If you're going to have a numerous amount of anything patrolling the galaxy, you're going to want something like the X-Wing that could do a little bit of everything. More importantly, if the Empire had embraced the Incom T-65B platform, it's very likely that the Incom design and engineering team would not have defected from the Empire, which also means that the T-65B X-Wing plans would have never been sent to the rebellion. And so instead of facing the X-Wing, the Empire would have X-Wings and be going up against antiquated Y-Wings and the more finicky A-Wing. This would have been a huge problem for the rebels, because the X-Wing, while slightly less maneuverable than the TIE Fighter, had proton torpedoes on it, something that most standard TIE Fighters lacked. In most of the early engagements between the Rebellion and the Empire, it was small rebel fleets coming under attack by Imperial patrol units that were usually only equipped with laser cannons. These laser cannons were capable. You could easily take out engines or shields on a specific vessel, but an X-Wing with proton torpedoes completely changes the game. You could vaporize the standard Rebel CR-90 with just one of these munitions. And a lot of important early missions by the Rebellion would have resulted in the death of key personnel as a result. If the Empire had X-Wings during the flight for Mon Mothma from Coruscant, it's very possible that her shuttle would have been destroyed by proton torpedoes long before the rebels could get her to safety. Do you guys remember the Battle of Scarif, when the huge cloud of TIE Fighter rises up from the planetary shield gate and attacks the rebel flagship, the Profundity? Well, imagine instead of having TIE Fighters, the Empire had X-Wings with proton torpedoes. What do you think would have happened to the rebel fleet in that scenario? There's a reason why the rebels usually just field a few squadrons versus the Empire when they're fighting them. They're always outnumbered, but because their ships were armed with so many heavy munitions, including the proton torpedo, that was an equalizer. But if the Empire has the X-Wing, not only will they now have numbers on their side, they'll also have immense amount of firepower that could completely destroy and track down the rebels. Imagine the Empire just operating millions of these X-Wings, scouring every system with these birds on reconnaissance missions instead of using the Viper droid. This would very much change the way the Rebel Alliance operated in the galaxy. A lot of people don't realize, the Rebel Alliance had a logistical tail. It was just a little less concentrated than the Empire's, and they basically had a network of safe worlds all across the galaxy where they built munitions, where they did things like grew Bacta, make bandages, repair vehicles. They had to have places where soldiers rotated off the front, or where the families of soldiers and pilots stayed and were safe, because probably their homeworlds were occupied. And so, these safe worlds are now going to be under threat, because the Empire has 10x, 30x, 50x the amount of individual hyperdrive equipped vessels by having the X-Wing instead of the TIE Fighter. Again, game changing. Now, could the X-Wing win the Galactic Civil War for the Empire? Well, just like in our last video about the Gladiator-class Star Destroyer replacing the Imperial-class, the Empire's problems went far beyond just its military and which ships it selected. They were fundamental political and economic and social issues that could not be fixed with X-wings and required a fundamental change in leadership. Palpatine's leadership was just not sustainable. In the long run, he created more enemies than he could kill, and that is the major problem. Now, the X-wing probably could have extended his role a few years, maybe a few decades even, but ultimately, I really don't think the Empire made any sense, politically, socially, economically, it was just doomed to collapse. But this goes to show you that, this is how events unfold in Star Wars. You have one starship missing in one battle, and then boom, the course of history changes. You have the TIE Fighter instead of the X-wing, which leads to how the Galactic Civil War ultimately played out. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.